Welcome to our online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted to be your host for many of the programs in this series. I want to thank the Dobbin House Restaurant and Tavern for its continuing support of all of our programs, and I thank all of you, our viewers, who have generously contributed as well. We welcome your donations because we are in the middle of a building campaign to save the million-plus artifacts that we have here, which are in need of secure storage. We will be opening in 2022 our new library, museum, and education center. And I welcome any donations from any of you to help us make this dream come true. There's a very safe and easy way to do it using the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Now, tonight's program is one that touches me personally because I have been involved for many years in doing research into World War II, where my father and three of my uncles served. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the World War II veterans who are buried at the National Cemetery here in Gettysburg. And what I'd like to do, by way of introduction of our speaker and our theme, is turn this over to a video intro and let you see the cemetery for yourselves for a tour. Thank you very much for joining us. There are 1,624 World War II veterans buried in this national cemetery. They total 23% of the total graves here in Gettysburg. We're going to take a look at some of their final resting places for both men and women and representatives from all branches of the military: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Corps. Our program today owes a huge debt of gratitude to this man, licensed battlefield guide Ralph Siegel, who worked for several years to build a database of the World War II grave sites, a project that he continues to refine as he gathers new information. From those 1,624 graves, Ralph found nearly 500 who died in combat, and he did intensive research into the stories of those combat veterans, even contacting their families to locate photographs. We will see some of the precious photographs today as we tour one of those sections of the cemetery with World War II veterans. Our tour guide today is Tara Wenzel, a Department of Defense employee with over 37 years of experience. Now retired from the government, Tara teaches leadership courses with Tigrit Leadership Academy, and she conducts weekend tours of World War II sites in Gettysburg. Let's see what insights she can offer on the World War II veterans buried at the Gettysburg National Cemetery.
Hi, my name is Tara Wenzel, and I'm so honored and privileged to be with you here today to share a little bit of my Gettysburg. You see, most visitors come to Gettysburg to learn about and pay honor to the United States Civil War, hopefully our only Civil War. But the Gettysburg I share with visitors has a rich history in addition to the Civil War. It's a history many do not know also took place here. My Gettysburg shows visitors that the same area where Pickett's Charge took place, a World War I tank training camp known as Camp Colt, was commanded by a young Captain Dwight D Eisenhower. And at that same location, Camp Colt was reopened in World War II to house a POW camp for German prisoners who worked in the surrounding area. My Gettysburg visits the Peace Light that was dedicated in 1938 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where in his 9-minute speech he carefully chooses words to try to reassure a nervous nation that the U.S. would not be drawn into World War II. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor would change all of that. And in McMillan Woods, a former Depression-era civilian conservation corps camp became known as Camp Sharp and was pressed into World War II service as a psychological warfare training camp. The secret map-making facility nestled between Big and Little Round Tops to create maps aiding in the war in the Pacific. My Gettysburg includes the stories of some famous visitors to Gettysburg, including JFK, Bernard Montgomery, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Nikita Khrushchev. And lastly, how during World War II, the National Park Service was forced to create a prioritized list of Civil War monuments to be melted down to support the war effort. This is the Gettysburg I share with visitors, and one that I absolutely love doing. But no visit to my Gettysburg is complete without coming here to the nation's first national cemetery, dedicated on 19 November 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, and today cared for with honor by the National Park Service. While it started out as a way to honor the dead of the Civil War, it also became the final resting place for veterans from the Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. I'm so pleased you're joining me today for this part of my Gettysburg. We will be visiting Section 2 of the cemetery, which has the largest group of World War II heroes buried here, some of whose stories I will be sharing with you today. Every time I share these stories, I'm reminded why this became known as the greatest generation. Come on, let's go in. Welcome to the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Believe it or not, this was the nation's first national cemetery. Many people think that Arlington was the first national cemetery, but it was not. Gettysburg was actually the first nationally recognized cemetery. We beat out Arlington by a year. And interestingly enough, a little snippet here for you, the first burial at Arlington National Cemetery was a Pennsylvania boy. So here we are at Gettysburg National Cemetery, and we're going to share the stories of some heroic World War II heroes here that are buried here in the cemetery. Something to watch for when you're here visiting the cemetery. There's a wonderful Jewish tradition that says when you visit a grave site, that you leave a pebble on that headstone. And you'll notice that we will do that as part of our tour here today as well. When you leave that pebble on the headstone, when the family members come and visit the gravesite, they will know, as a result of that pebble being there, that their loved ones had not been forgotten. And so it's a wonderful Jewish tradition. The U.S. military picked up on this tradition as well. And the U.S. military, when they picked up on the tradition, they decided to use coins. Now, for a long time, I had no idea what the coins meant, but having been out to the Flight 93 Memorial out in Shanksville, having been out to the Pentagon Memorial, having been out to the New York City Memorial for the 9/11 destruction that took place, I always saw coins out there, and I always wondered, why coins? And so I did a little research, and I was able to find out that the coins for the military have meaning. If a penny is left on the headstone, it means that it's soldier to soldier. I don't know you, I don't know who you were, but I visited your gravesite, and out of respect, I'm going to leave a penny on your gravesite to let your loved ones know that you have not been forgotten. If they leave a nickel, it means that they went through basic training together. And so there is a relationship that you had with that person whose gravesite you're visiting. If a dime is left, it meant that you served together sometime in your military career outside of basic training. And the one that haunts me the most is the quarter. If you see a quarter set on top of a headstone, it means that you were with that person when they died, when they were killed. And there has been one occasion here in the Gettysburg National Cemetery that I have seen a quarter on a headstone, and it absolutely gave me chills. So here lies Regis Bodker. He was 24 years old when he was killed. He was a yeoman first class in the U.S. Navy. Now, his story is particularly poignant to me because he served on board the USS Helena. When the USS Helena came into port down at Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor, there was no place for her to berth. So, as the military typically does, they said, well, go over there, just pull in there. And they had her berth at the location where the USS Pennsylvania normally berths, in Battlefield Row. Now, we have maps from the Japanese attackers at Pearl Harbor where they were gunning for the USS Pennsylvania. This was the Navy's largest warship. And the reason why the Japanese were gunning for the USS Pennsylvania is they felt that they could deliver a crippling morale blow to the U.S. Navy if they could sink their biggest warship. So they were aiming for that berth, not realizing that the USS Pennsylvania had been pulled and put into dry dock. So the USS Helena was there. The Helena suffered the heaviest losses of any cruiser during the 7 December attack. Bodker himself, he suffered third-degree burns. Now, they did manage to get him off the ship and to a hospital in Hawaii, but he died of his wounds later that day. So, Louis Flanigan, he was from Clinton, Pennsylvania. As you can see, he was 30 years old when he died, and his story for me is probably the one that touches me the most out of the ones we're going to be talking about today. The reason for that is because he was a combat medic, so he was not carrying a gun. He was there to treat the wounded. Now, he was awarded the Bronze Star for fighting at St. Lo and for rescuing some men that had been trapped by a sniper. So the way this unfolded, as the story goes, one man went out, the sniper hit him, he went down in the field. Another man went out to rescue him, he was also hit by the sniper. Third guy goes out, because of course the military leaves no man behind, and he also got hit by the sniper. Lewis Flanigan crawled out onto the field, rescued all three men, and brought them back to safety. And they all survived to tell the tale, for which he was awarded his Bronze Star. Here's a gentleman, he was killed, as you can see by the date, on Christmas Day during the Battle of the Bulge. And documentation from those who lay wounded around him during the Battle of the Bulge said that he actually was comforting other men as he lay there bleeding out, telling them it was going to be okay, that everything was going to be all right. A true hero. So here we have George Zembrowski, Seaman First Class, age 20 when he passed away. And you'll notice the date of his death. So he was involved with Pearl Harbor. Now he was on board ship, the USS Nevada. If you know anything about the attack on Pearl Harbor, you'll remember that the USS Nevada was the only ship that had a full head of steam the day of the attack. When her captain realized what was happening, he decided to rush the ship out of the harbor and out to sea, hopefully to save the ship from the kind of damage that they were seeing inflicted on the other ships in Battleship Row. As a result, when the Japanese realized what the captain of the USS Nevada was doing, they turned their guns on her because they felt if they could sink her in the middle of the harbor, she would block the harbor and none of the other ships would be able to get out, making them sitting ducks for the second wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the captain realized what the Japanese were doing, he intentionally beached the USS Nevada, making her a prime, immovable target for the Japanese. George Zembrowski was killed in the second wave of the attack when the ship was beached and a sitting duck for the Japanese guns. Here looks a little bit different than some of the other stones that we've been looking at. In a national cemetery, there are only two types of stones that can be used, and neither type weathers well. And so as a result, they do have to periodically be replaced. We believe that this is a newer stone compared to some of the others that was a replacement for the original stone that George Zembrowski would have had placed here at his internment. Here we have Clarenceriggs from Coldport, Pennsylvania. He served in the 116th Regiment and was killed in action on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. Howard Baumgarten was on the same landing craft that Clarenceriggs was on. And this is what Baumgarten would write in his memoirs. The Company B boat to our left blew up, and we were showered with wood, metal, and body parts. And of course, blood, lots of blood. The lowering of the ramp was like a signal for every German machine gun to open up on the exit from our boat. Clarenceriggs was shot dead on the ramp and fell down, face down in the water. I dove in behind him, and only my helmet was grazed with the bullet. And there I was standing neck deep in bloody red water with my rifle above my head. Can you imagine what these young men faced as they landed on the beach that day? Clarenceriggs never quite made it to the beach. Howard Baumgarten did, and in the span of 48 hours was wounded 5 times. The last time he was wounded, as he was trying to make it past the beach, his jaw was completely shot off, and he was finally taken to a hospital ship out in the ocean. Now, I had an opportunity to meet Howard Baumgarten before he passed away, and that was truly an honor. There's a World War II weekend that's held every year in Reading, Pennsylvania, and it's become kind of a tradition for us to go, and that's how I met Howard Baumgarten. And just the stories that these veterans tell of their experiences, just amazing, absolutely amazing. Out of the 30 men that were on Clarenceriggs and Baumgarten's landing craft that day, 28 would be killed in action trying to secure the beach. Only 2 survived. One day, when I was providing a World War II tour of the cemetery, I came across a coin on Clarenceriggs' gravesite, and it was a quarter. Now, if you remember in our introduction when we talked about the military picking up the coins and what the coins mean, a quarter means that you were killed that you were with the gentlemen when they were killed in action. Considering the fact that there were 28 out of the 30 that died that day, that meant the person who visited Clarenceriggs' site, knowing that Baumgarten is now passed as well, had to be the only surviving member of that landing craft. Here we have the grave of Frederick Clark. Now, Frederick Clark was age 29 and he was from Pittsburgh. He was a member of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The key word here is observation. These were not heavily armed men. These men were sent out to observe. Unfortunately, the unit that Clark was in was ambushed in Belgium near a small village by the name of Normandy. And the SS were the ones that came upon this unit. You know, under Geneva Convention, they were supposed to be taken to a prisoner of war camp to wait out the war. That was what the Geneva Convention stated. And for the most part, Americans followed, very detailed, down to the letter, the Geneva Convention. The SS decided not to do that, and they lined these gentlemen up in a snowy farmer's field and machine gunned them down. Frederick Clark was one of those that was killed, but there was a gentleman in the unit that fell wounded and a body fell on top of him. And had it not been for this particular gentleman, the Normandy massacre might never have been reported. The SS, wanting to make sure that all the men that they gunned down were dead, once they machine gunned them down, they took out their sidearms and they started walking to the first man and shot him in the head to make sure that he was dead. They walked to the second man, shot him in the head to make sure he was dead. And here's this gentleman lying wounded with a body on top of him, hearing the footsteps crunching in the snow, getting closer and closer and closer. Right about that time, when he thought his number was up, a U.S. convoy came riding by, and it scattered the SS soldiers. They took off running. So here are these bodies lying in this farmer's field. Well, the farmer and his wife came out and found the wounded man. They took him into their home, and they ministered to him and managed to save his life. Now, the U.S. military realized that this unit had not reported in. They knew the path that they were supposed to be taking, so they sent out vehicles looking for them. Well, the snow by that time had covered all the bodies. So vehicles were passing by the area where this massacre took place and had no idea. Eventually, the farmer flagged down one of the vehicles to let them know that they had one of their soldiers in their home. And that's how the word of the Malmedy Massacre came out. The military eventually did come out and they unburied the bodies, which by that point were frozen solid, and loaded them into trucks, which had to be a very horrific job. It was only at that point where there were occasions where American military soldiers did not abide by the Geneva Convention. It became what you might call a remember the Alamo moment, that some of our soldiers did not do what they were supposed to do as far as the Geneva Convention was concerned too. But those incidents were extremely rare. And that's the story of Frederick Clark. So let me introduce you to the Materowicz brothers. Here we have Edward, age 19 when he was killed, and we have Frank, age 21. The brothers being from Etna, Pennsylvania. Now, one of the things to notice here is the younger brother, Edward, is a higher rank than his older brother, Frank. So let's talk a little bit about why that happened. So Frank Materowicz, he volunteered and went into the military and became a paratrooper in the elite 101st Airborne Division. Now, some of you may remember those 101st Airborne guys in this photograph, this very, very famous, iconic photograph with Dwight D Eisenhower. One of the reasons why I love this photograph so much is because there are many people who believe that Eisenhower, given his body language, is giving orders of the day, telling the paratroopers what their mission was going to be, but he just looks like he's all business. And nothing could be further from the truth. If you get the opportunity to see Ike count down to D-Day, which will show up on your screen here, you will find the real story behind this iconic photograph. Eisenhower was a people person. He was quiet and reserved, but he truly cared about his troops. And he had been getting very disturbing figures, estimates from his generals on just how decimated the paratroopers were going to be on D-Day. They were figuring a huge casualty rate. So he decides he's going to go out, since this might be the last mission for many of these young men. He decides he's going to go out to the tarmac and visit with these men before they go off on D-Day. I mean, their job was to draw the fire of the troops so they could land on the beachhead. So he goes out, and in the movie it's beautifully depicted. He's very, very quiet. He's very, very, almost like he's feeling sad about what's about to happen. But when he gets out of the vehicle and goes out to these troops, he's just, shaking hands. Now, the funny part to this story is the troops had all been told by their commanders, the general's coming out here. He doesn't care who you are or where you're from. All he wants to know is where you took your paratrooper training. So when Eisenhower walks up to the first guy and he goes, "Hello, son, where are you from?" The response, the kid looked a little confused, and he gave his paratrooper school. But Eisenhower said to him, "No, son, I didn't ask you where you took your training. I asked you where you were from." And the kid looked really scared. He's looking off to his commanders about what he should do. And finally he answers the general's question. Then Eisenhower goes to the next kid and he shakes his hand. And as he's going through, he asks if there's anybody from Kansas. Now, Eisenhower was born in Texas, but he moved to Kansas as a child and always viewed Abilene, Kansas as his home. So he asked the crew if there's anybody there from Kansas. And one kid raises his hand, and Eisenhower goes up to him and shakes his hand, and he says, "Are you a fisherman's son?" And the kid goes, "Oh, yes, sir, only every chance I can get." And Eisenhower says to him, well, have you ever been to Lake such and such? He names a lake in Kansas. And the kid says, yes, sir, I know that lake very well. And Eisenhower says, well, what do you use to fish in that lake? What kind of lure do you use? And so this iconic picture is actually of Eisenhower talking with this young man from Kansas about fishing lures and how he tied fishing lures to go fishing in this lake in Kansas. Photograph that remains in history, but not a lot of people know the side story to that. Now, as you can see, Frank survived the jump on D-Day. He was killed a few days later in France, and he was buried in France. Now, Edward, his story was, he was a B-17 crewman. And B-17 crewmen, at the time that the war was going on, B-17s were literally being shot out of the sky. They were just being attacked. They were slow moving. The big problem that they had with the escorts that were there to protect them was the escorts, because of fuel concerns, could only go part of the way to the mission. And then the B-17s would have to continue on to the bombing run on their own. Well, the German Lufthansa would wait until they passed that kind of that line of demarcation, and then they would come and attack the B-17s. So we were losing B-17s like crazy. A little bit later, we're going to talk about what saved the B-17s for the rest of the war. But at this point, they were still losing a lot of B-17s, and they had a lot of casualties. Now, you'll notice, as I mentioned, that Edward is a higher rank than his brother. And the reason why the military did that is because they felt that if the B-17 was shot down and the crews survived the shoot down, that if they were taken prisoner, that they would be treated better in a POW camp as a higher rank than what they would be if they were shown as enlisted. So for that reason, Edward will outrank his brother for the rest of their days. So this is very rare to see two brothers buried side by side. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Frank was killed in France, and he was buried in France. And Edward was killed in Belgium when his plane was shot down, and he was buried in Belgium. So how did the two brothers end up here after the war side by side at Gettysburg National Cemetery? And the answer to that is, after the war was over, the U.S. military reached out to the family members of the fallen and asked them, did you want your son, daughter, husband, what have you, to be buried where they're at, or do you want us to bring them home? The Materowicz family decided to bring their boys home, and here they are buried side by side. And as I said, this is a rarity. There are not too many documented records of brothers being buried side by side. But here at Gettysburg National Cemetery, we do have a set of brothers that did come home. Here lies Captain Frederick Dorst. He was age 24, a Pittsburgh boy, buried here at Gettysburg National Cemetery. Now, he was a P51 Mustang pilot, confirmed ace in the 31st Fighter Group with 8 confirmed kills. Now, there's a lot of information about P51s. If you remember, when we were talking about the Materowicz brothers and the brother that was on the B-17s, and I mentioned that B-17s were literally being shot out of the sky. Well, the turning point for that was the invention of the P51 Mustangs. These aircraft were used for escorts for the B-17 bombers, and from the time that they were employed, we never lost another B-17 until the end of the war. There's a big reason for that. The problem that they were having with the former escorts was that they could not go the entire distance. So what would happen is the escorts would go as far as they could because of fuel considerations, and then they would have to turn around and go back, which left the bombers unprotected. And the German Lufthansa knew that. They knew that this is how they operated. So they would wait just outside the line of where the escorts would turn around and go back, and then they would attack the bombers. So we were losing bombers right and left. Because of the P-51s, which had fuel tanks under the wings, it allowed the P-51s to escort the bombers all the way to their destination and follow them all the way home. And as I said, you know, we never lost another B-17 all the way through till the end of the war. So great advent with these P-51 Mustangs. Now, no story about P-51 Mustangs would be complete without at least mentioning a squadron of elite P-51 Mustang pilots called the Tuskegee Airmen, or the Red Tails, as they've been known as. And if you have not seen this particular movie, I would wholeheartedly recommend that you get it. And here's the reason why. Here in Pennsylvania, every year on the first full weekend in June, in Reading, we have what's known as the World War II weekend. And my favorite part of that weekend is the fact that they have World War II veterans there, available to talk to you, available to hear their stories. And there have been several occasions where I've met men and videotaped their stories, and those men are now no longer with us. So it's kind of a labor of love to be able to fall back on these stories. Well, in one of the weekends that we had, my husband had the opportunity to meet and chat with a Tuskegee Airman, and this would have been in 2012. This gentleman has now passed on. He is no longer with us. Now, at that time, in 2012, the Red Tails movie had just come out, and my husband asked him, "Sir, what do you think of the movie? Have you seen it?" And the gentleman got the most beautiful smile on his face, and he said, "Only about 5 times." And my husband said, "Well, what do you think? Do you think it was factual for what you saw?" And he said, "Son, let me tell you, I can say with assurance that everything in that movie I experienced." Now, the pilots, the B-17 pilots, started calling these P-51 Mustang pilots their little friends. Although there was a lot of racism in the military at the time, this didn't cross lines with these P-51 Mustang pilots. These B-17 pilots would take some of these P-51 Tuskegee Airmen into some of the officer club bars, and they were met with resistance. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen didn't want any trouble, but they would walk out. The B-17 pilots would be the ones getting in the fight with the racists who didn't want these Tuskegee Airmen in there. And it's portrayed beautifully in the movie. The beauty of this is that these Tuskegee Airmen were elite, they were educated, all of them had college degrees, and they had something to prove. And so as a result, they became one of the most elite fighting forces for pilots in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So how many of you are good at math? I want you to take a look at Paul Heller's information and try to figure out what his age is. And I think you'll be fairly surprised. So, you might ask yourself, how did a young man, age 15, lose his life in battle? How did he get into the Marine Corps at all? So I did a little digging on Mr. Paul Heller, and I found out a little bit about his life story. Apparently, this was a very troubled youth. He ran away from home 3 times, so his home life must not have been all the best for him. Each time he ran away, he was brought back. Eventually, what he did was he faked his birth certificate, kind of altered the date a little bit, and went in and enlisted. And as a result, he got into the U.S. Marine Corps at age 15. The very first place that he would go to is Guadalcanal. And my grandfather that I mentioned earlier also talked about Guadalcanal in reverent terms as well. So the story behind Guadalcanal, which I didn't know a lot about, was that the Marines landed and then the ships, their supply ships, were chased away by Japanese warships. And so as a result, these young men were left stranded on Guadalcanal with not a lot of supplies. So for 2 months, from the time that they landed until the time that Paul Heller lost his young life, he lived on rice and rats for the 2 months that he was there. Eventually, the Marine Corps did take Guadalcanal, and it was a win for us. But if you take a look at Paul Heller, you can see why he was able to fake his age so easily. Thank you for allowing me to share a small part of my Gettysburg with you tonight. I hope you'll come and share my Gettysburg in person sometime. But I want to finish your virtual visit here to the National Cemetery by reading those words made famous back in 1863. And as you hear them, think about how they still resonate today. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work for which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.